My name is Madison, and I'm 27 years old. 3 weeks before my wedding, my mother called me with a tone I recognized instantly, the tone she used whenever she was about to ask me to give something up. "Sweetheart," she said, "we need to talk about the venue deposit." I was standing in my kitchen holding a paint swatch for the guest book table, and something in her voice made my stomach drop before she even finished the sentence. My fiancé, Grant, was in the next room assembling centerpieces we'd spent 2 months designing. I stepped outside onto the porch so he wouldn't hear whatever was coming. "What about it?" I asked. "Your father and we made a commitment to your sister. Bianca's trip to Bali, the one for her and Jason's anniversary. It's non-refundable, and it's the same week as your wedding, and we just don't have the funds to cover both." I actually laughed, because I thought she was joking. Bianca was my younger sister, 24, married for exactly 1 year, and this trip had been mentioned maybe twice at Thanksgiving as a vague someday dream. My wedding had been planned for 14 months. Save the dates were mailed. The dress was altered and hanging in a garment bag in my closet. "Mom, you already paid the venue deposit." "That's done." "What are you talking about?" "We paid the first half," she said. "The final payment is due Friday. And we can't do both. Bianca's flights are already booked. If we don't send the resort payment this week, they lose the whole package. So cancel the trip," I said, my voice climbing. "It's a vacation, Mom. This is my wedding." There was a long pause, the kind of pause that told me she'd already made her decision before she called. "Your father and I talked about it. We think it would be easier to postpone your wedding. Just by a few months. You and Grant can still get married, just not in June." Easier. That word sat in my chest like a stone. Easier for whom? Not for me, not for Grant, not for the 140 people who'd already RSVP'd, not for the caterer who required 60 days notice for cancellation, not for the string quartet we'd booked 8 months in advance. "You're telling me you canceled my wedding to save my sister's vacation," I said slowly, testing the sentence, needing to hear it out loud because it didn't sound real even as I said it. "We're not canceling anything, we're postponing," my mother said, and I could hear in her voice that she believed there was a real difference between those two words. "Bianca has been under so much stress since the miscarriage. Jason thinks this trip could really help her. You're strong, Madison. You've always been the strong one. You'll understand. You've always been the strong one." I'd heard that sentence my whole life, usually right before I was asked to absorb something that wasn't fair. When I was 12 and gave up my bedroom so Bianca could have the bigger one because she got more anxious in small spaces. When I was 16 and my parents used my college fund deposit to cover Bianca's emergency braces, promising to pay me back, a promise that quietly evaporated. When I was 22 and drove 4 hours home from my first real job to help move Bianca into her first apartment, no explanation needed, because that's just what strong people did. I stood on that porch in the June heat, the paint swatch still in my hand, and I felt something inside me that had been bending quietly for 27 years finally go still and hard, like water freezing all at once. "I need to think," I said, and I hung up before she could respond. I didn't go back inside right away. I sat down on the porch steps and looked at the swatch in my hand, a soft sage green we'd picked for the table linens, and I thought about every time I had made myself smaller so someone else could take up more space. I thought about Bianca, who had never once, in 24 years, been asked to be the strong one. And I thought about my parents, who had learned over decades that Madison would always bend, that Madison would always understand, that Madison's needs were the ones that could be moved around like furniture whenever something more urgent came along. Something more urgent. My wedding, 14 months of planning, the dress, the deposits, the people who had already bought plane tickets to be there for me, all of it filed under less urgent than a beach vacation for a marriage that had existed for exactly 1 year. When Grant came outside to find me, he took one look at my face and sat down beside me without saying a word. I told him everything, and when I finished, he didn't tell me to calm down, and he didn't tell me my parents probably had a good reason. He just took my hand and said, "What do you want to do?" And for the first time in my entire life, I understood that the question actually had an answer that belonged only to me. I looked at him, and I felt that frozen, hardened thing inside my chest settle into something else entirely. Something closer to clarity. "I'm not postponing anything," I said. And I think it's time my parents learned exactly what happens when you cancel my wedding to save my sister's vacation. He didn't ask what I meant. He just squeezed my hand, and I sat there on that porch step, already building the plan that would change everything. I didn't call my parents back that Friday. Instead, I called the venue. The coordinator, a woman named Delphine who had walked me through every detail of our contract, picked up on the second ring. I explained the situation as calmly as I could manage, and when I asked if there was any way to protect the date without the final payment my parents had promised to make, she was quiet for a moment before she said something I'll never forget. "Madison, the final payment isn't due from your parents. It's due from whoever's name is on the contract. And that's you." I sat with that for a long moment. In all the months of planning, I'd let my mother handle the big checks because she'd insisted, because she'd wanted to feel like she was contributing to the wedding of her firstborn daughter. But the contract, the actual legal agreement, had my signature on it, not hers. Her payments had been a gift, not an obligation, which meant her decision to withhold that money wasn't canceling anything. It was simply her stepping back and leaving the responsibility exactly where it had always technically belonged, with me. That night, Grant and I sat at our kitchen table with our laptop and our savings account open in front of us. It wasn't enough to cover everything my parents had promised, not comfortably, but it was enough if we cut the flowers down, switched the catering to a smaller package, and I picked up 2 freelance design projects I'd been putting off. It would be tight. It would also be entirely, completely ours. I called my mother the next morning. "I'm not postponing the wedding," I told her. "Grant and I are covering the remaining balance ourselves. You and Dad don't need to worry about it anymore." There was a long silence, and then, unbelievably, disappointment in her voice. "Madison, that's not necessary. We just need you to be a little patient. Bianca needs this. Bianca is an adult with a job and a husband," I said, keeping my voice level even as my hands shook. "She can plan her own vacation around my wedding date instead of expecting my wedding to move around hers. I love her, but I'm done being the one who bends." "You're being selfish," my mother said, and there it was, the word I'd been waiting my whole life to hear applied to me instead of to everyone who'd ever asked something of me. "After everything this family has done for you." "Everything this family has done for me is exactly why I'm not doing this anymore," I said. "I gave up my bedroom. I gave up my college fund. I've spent 27 years being the strong one, so nobody had to feel bad about choosing Bianca. I'm not angry that you love her. I'm angry that loving her always seemed to cost me something." My mother didn't have a response for that. I told her I loved her, that I hoped she and my father would still come to the wedding, and that the door was open if she wanted to talk more honestly than we ever had before. Then I hung up, and I let myself cry for exactly 10 minutes, and then I got up and finished addressing invitation envelopes because the wedding was still happening whether anyone else believed in it or not. The weeks that followed were not easy. Bianca texted me twice, once furious, once tearful, both times centered entirely on how my decision had affected her. I didn't respond to either. My father called once, quiet and awkward, and admitted in a roundabout way that he'd disagreed with the plan from the start but hadn't wanted to fight my mother on it. That conversation, at least, felt like the beginning of something real. On the morning of my wedding, I stood in the little dressing room at the venue in my altered dress, and Delphine knocked to tell me a car had just pulled up. It was my father. Alone. He walked me down the aisle with tears in his eyes and told me, quietly, that he was proud of me for finally putting myself first. My mother and Bianca didn't come. That absence sat with me during the ceremony, a small ache underneath an otherwise perfect day, but it didn't undo any of it. Grant and I danced under string lights we'd paid for ourselves, surrounded by people who had shown up for us, and for the first time in my life, nothing about the day belonged to anyone else's convenience. 6 months later, my mother finally called to apologize. Really apologize, not the kind that came wrapped in an excuse. She told me she'd realized, watching an empty seat where her daughter should have been, that she'd spent so many years protecting Bianca from disappointment that she'd forgotten Madison deserved protecting too. We're rebuilding, slowly. Bianca and I are still finding our way back to something resembling a relationship. But I don't regret a single second of that summer, because it taught me the one lesson I should have learned decades earlier. Being the strong one doesn't mean you have to be the one who always gives everything up. If this story hit home for you, if you've ever been the one expected to bend so someone else could stay comfortable, hit that subscribe button right now, because there are so many more stories like mine waiting for you here, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next.